Hello everyone. In this video, we'll be talking about the landmark court case of Brown versus Board of Education and its impact on the civil rights movement in America. In this 1954 case, the U.S. Supreme Court decided that the practice of racial segregation of students in public schools violated the Constitution. The justices reached this conclusion unanimously. Brown versus Board of Education was one of the most important cases in the history of the civil rights movement because this case helped set a precedent that separate but equal education and other forms of service were not, in fact, equal to one another at all. In the previous historic case of Plessy versus Ferguson, which took place in 1896, the Supreme Court decided that racially segregated public facilities were permissible as long as the facilities for black people and white people were equivalent. The Plessy ruling supported the legitimacy of racial segregation in accordance with the separate but equal theory. The incident that gave rise to the Plessy lawsuit occurred in 1892 when an African-American train passenger named Homer Plessy refused to sit in a car reserved for other African Americans. Plessy argued that his constitutional rights had been violated, but the Supreme Court found that a legislation that implies merely a legal distinction between white people and black people was not unconstitutional. The Plessy decision upheld Jim Crow laws which prohibited African Americans from using the same buses, schools, and other public facilities as white people. It also established the separate but equal theory, which was upheld for the next 60 years after the decision was handed down, during which time distinct racial segregation in public spaces became the norm. However, at the beginning of the 1950s, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, NAACP for short, was beginning to exert a significant effort to fight segregation in public schools. During this time, the NAACP filed cases on behalf of plaintiffs in states such as South Carolina, Virginia, and Delaware. And after his daughter, Linda Brown, was turned away from Topeka's all-white primary schools in 1951, a plaintiff named Oliver Brown filed a class action lawsuit against the Board of Education of Topeka, Kansas. This was the beginning of the case that would go on to become the most renowned of its kind. Brown argued in his complaint that the schools for black students were substandard in comparison to the schools for white children, and that segregation violated the so-called Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. This article states that a state may not deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. However, although acknowledging that public school segregation had a detrimental effect upon colored children and contributed to a sense of inferiority, the United States District Court for the District of Kansas supported the separate but equal theory. So Brown appealed his case to the U.S. Supreme Court. And then Brown's case, along with 4 other issues relating to school segregation, were brought before the Supreme Court for the first time in 1952. At that time, the court decided to consolidate all 5 cases into a single proceeding, which was given the name Brown versus Board of Education of Topeka, but it is often shortened to just Brown versus Board of Education. And the primary attorney for the plaintiffs in this case was Thurgood Marshall, who was also the chairman of the NAACP Legal Defense and Educational Fund. Now, initially, there was a split among the Supreme Court justices as to how they should rule on the issue of school segregation, with Chief Justice Fred M. Vinson being of the opinion that the Plessy verdict should be upheld. But in December of 1953, Vinson passed away, and President Dwight D. Eisenhower promptly replaced him with Earl Warren, who was serving at the time as the governor of California. And in the next year, thanks to his enormous political savvy and dogged resolve, the newly appointed Chief Justice Warren was in fact able to successfully orchestrate a unanimous ruling against school segregation. And in the decision that was handed down on May 17, 1954, Warren stated that in the field of public education, the doctrine of separate but equal has no place, since segregated schools are inherently unequal. As a consequence of this, the Supreme Court came to the conclusion that the plaintiffs were being denied the equal protection of the laws as provided by the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. And in its decision, the Supreme Court did not provide any specifics regarding the manner in which schools should be integrated, but it did request additional arguments on the subject. So in May of 1955, the U.S. Supreme Court published its second ruling in the case, which became known as Brown versus Board of Education II. In this judgment, the court remanded future desegregation cases to lower federal courts and instructed district courts and school boards to move through with desegregation with all deliberate speed. But despite the fact that the actions of the court were done with good intentions, they successfully opened the door for local judicial and political evasion of desegregation. Although Kansas and a few other states took actions that were consistent with the ruling, a large number of school and local officials in the South disobeyed it. And in fact, in 1957, Governor Orville Faubus of Arkansas ordered the deployment of the state's National Guard in an effort to stop black students from enrolling in high schools in the city of Little Rock. This is just one example. And following a tense standoff, President Eisenhower ordered the deployment of federal forces, which allowed 9 students, who came to be known as the Little Rock Nine, to attend Central High School while being protected by military guards. Now, in spite of the fact that the decision of the Supreme Court in Brown versus the Board of Education did not result in the desegregation of schools on its own, the judgment, as well as the strong resistance to it across the South, was a significant factor in the development of the civil rights movement in the United States. Rosa Parks famously stood her ground and refused to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama in 1955, just 1 year after the judgment in Brown versus Board of Education. Her arrest was a spark that ignited the Montgomery bus boycott, which in turn led to further boycotts, sit-ins, and protests, many of which were led by Martin Luther King Jr., and all of which were part of a movement that would finally result in the overturning of Jim Crow laws across the South. And the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and subsequent implementation of its provisions by the Justice Department marked the beginning of the desegregation process in earnest. After the passage of this historic piece of civil rights legislation, the following year saw the passing of the Voting Rights Act in 1965 and the Fair Housing Act in 1968. And the United States Supreme Court handed down yet another precedent-setting judgment in the case of Runyon versus McCrary in 1976. In that case, the court held that even non-denominational private schools may not legally discriminate against prospective students on the basis of their race when making admissions decisions. By striking down the separate but equal theory, the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus Board of Education had set the legal precedent that would be used to invalidate laws enforcing segregation in other public facilities. Nevertheless, in spite of the undeniable impact it had, the historic judgment was not successful in accomplishing its principal objective, which was to integrate public schools across the country. And unfortunately, the debate over how to combat racial inequalities in the nation's school system continues today, almost 70 years after the Brown versus Board of Education decision. This debate is largely based on residential patterns and differences in resources between schools in wealthier districts and those in economically disadvantaged districts across the country. So what are your thoughts on the separate but equal doctrine? And what about your thoughts on the Brown versus Board of Education case? And do you think racial equality will ever be reached here in the United States? Please let us know in the comments down below. And thank you so much for watching, and we hope you are enjoying our social commentary videos, which are aimed at bringing awareness to everyone on societal issues of the past, present, and future. So hit the like button, share this video, and subscribe to our channel for similar content. Your support of the channel by watching the videos, liking them, and commenting on the videos is greatly appreciated. And we'll see you in the next video. Bye for now.